Oh, if you're hearing that sound, you know exactly what it means. It's time for IMNSHOW. In my not so humble opinion, a little bit of a DP's got something to say show about something that's tripped my trigger or interested me, or in this case, again, I'm going to be doing a live stream of my podcast, NONFICTION BRAND, which looks a little something like that right there. And with me is a special guest who I'm going to introduce in just a second. But first, I'm going to turn to my B cam to say welcome to this live stream and stick with us as we go through what I normally do for a podcast. So if you've ever wondered what it's like to be in a podcast session with someone like me, just watch, because you're going to find out the raw feed in all its ugliness, in all its beauty, and everything else. And by the way, since I edit my podcasts, anything stupid I say, I might leave in because that's my brand. But anything stupid or or likes or whatevers that my guest happens to say, they'll be cut out for the podcast. So definitely check out the podcast as well. Without further ado, let me introduce to you today's special guest. There she is from the lovely island of Victoria, British Columbia, in Canada. That's Mary Chan. Hello, Mary Chan. Welcome to the Nonfiction Brand podcast.
Thank you, DP. Hello.
Well, I'm so excited to have you. And I'll be honest with you. One of the things I've wanted to talk about for a long time is obviously I'm into the power of podcasting. I'm into the power of demonstrating who I am, what I do, and how I do it in front of people, at least in podcast form via audio. And now live streaming, I can do it with a camera on. But there are a ton of people out there who don't understand the power of audio, specifically having your voice in someone's ears. And I wanted to ask you about that specifically because as I look at your website and kind of what you're doing in the social media channels and stuff like that, you're focusing primarily on trying to get women to recognize the power of podcasting and the power of extending their own voice. And I wanted to hear more about that. So why don't you, first of all, give us about 30 seconds on what you do, your business, what it's called, and your podcast as well.
All right. I am the founder of Organized Sound Productions, a podcast production and consulting company. My podcast is called The Podcaster's Guide to a Visible Voice, a podcast on podcasting. And if you want to check it out on your podcast listening app of choice, just look up Visible Voice and you'll find it there.
You know what? I like that name, Visible Voice, because so many people don't really understand the power of making your voice visible in the form of a podcast. And, you know, I see you embracing that so much so that your business literally is about, from what I can tell, taking an absolute newbie from, I'd like to do a podcast to, hey, we got episodes up and we've got guests on and you are rocking and rolling. Talk me through, well, let me just play the role of one of your potential clients and say, hey, Mary, I have a small business. It's me and 5 other people, and we help nonprofits extend their reach in the marketplace in search of donors. I think it might be kind of cool to do a nonfiction or not a nonfiction brand. Get with the program, DP.
Too brand focused on
it might be. It might be cool to do a not-for-profit podcast. I just want to ask you the question: does it make sense to do a podcast focused on getting more donations for nonprofit organizations? And if so, can you help me through the process of how I would even get started?
Yes, for sure. And you know what? One of the best ways for a nonprofit organization to reach a bigger audience and to really tap into those heartstrings, because it really is about stories and storytelling that get people to open up their wallets for a nonprofit organization like yours. And podcasting would be a great extension of your existing marketing efforts and your brand, because with the power of podcasting, it traditionally would be audio only. People have got their headphones on, and your voice, whoever the host is for your particular podcast, that host is in the person's ear. telling you very vulnerable, intimate stories, and you as the listener would usually be one-on-one listening to that person as well, doing your own thing in your own life. In some people like to do the dishes, walk their dogs, go for a run at the gym. It's very personal time that you get to bring in these podcasts and listen to them and have that intimate connection. And an intimate way, I also mean by some people listen to the podcast when they're in the bathroom. Like, who else are you going to invite into your bathroom at any given moment? But people like to invite their podcast in, and they will listen and really connect with whoever is speaking. And so I think it's a great way for nonprofits to try and get a bigger reach and to tell those stories that are so, so important that don't really get heard in a way where it's written out for a post, an article, or, even those quick one-hit interviews on TV or a quick little Facebook Live. You can't really expand on that story and the emotional connection when you have the distractions of video. When it just becomes audio on podcasting, people really tune in. They really connect emotionally with what the host has to say.
Yeah, I got to underline a couple of things you said. It is a fantastic venue for storytelling. Yes, absolutely agree. For example, if you have a nonprofit that serves people, getting one of those clients or beneficiaries of your charity, your nonprofit, whatever it is, telling their story on your air, if you will,
Yeah.
There's no better way to prove what you do as a nonprofit organization. So you've got me sold on the idea of taking my fictional nonprofit onto the airwaves of a podcast. And you've even given me some hints as to how that might work. But continuing, I'm pretending to still be this person who has this nonprofit. I say, wow, that sounds fantastic. I'm a little concerned because how long should it be? I mean, do we have to have people in the same place? Can we do it via Zoom? Do I have to have a professional microphone and setup and stuff like that? Does my guest need that? I've got so many questions, Mary. Help me, please. Everything from the show outline to the name of it to
the music.
How do I get that? Yeah, music, rights-free music or legal music. How do I get one of those cool cover art squares that I can post on Instagram? And how can I get it to do that cool thing where people talk and the thing goes up and down? Do you know how to do that? Is that expensive? Can you teach me how to do that? Obviously, I'm pretending. I know the answer to these questions because I had to find them out the hard way. Is this like part of your service? Do you act as not only a coach, but a hand holder, as a don't worry, we can do this counselor and all that?
Counselor, that's a great way to put it because sometimes it really is. So, like, the business is multiple facets. There is people such as solo entrepreneurs who want to launch a podcast, and I can teach them through a do-it-yourself method in a course way. And then there's also the management side of the podcast business, which is the editing, the making those square things with the movie waveformy things you were talking about. Those are called audiograms, creating assets for your show, finding the best clips and editing in a way that fits your show. So when you talk about editing, a lot of people think of just removing the ums, the ahs, putting in the intro, the outro, and making it sound nice, whatever that means. But really, for me, coming from a radio background, I edit each show and I teach the rest of my team this way too, is that when you're editing a show, it's going to be based very much on each single episode because each episode will have a different emotional connection. So in your, say, nonprofit space, if you are sharing these stories and the guests that you bring on are going to be extremely vulnerable, they're coming from a place where it could be, health concerns within their family members, and that's deep. That is personal. And they're sharing these stories. Leaving an in there is totally fine. Letting something breathe and relax is going to be okay. because you need that humanized approach to editing to create that emotional aspect of the story. But if we're doing a professional episode, like maybe for your nonfiction brand, I'm going to clean up those ums and ahs. I am going to take out some of those pauses, like when I'm trying to figure out, how am I going to answer this? That's a great question. I'm going to take that stuff out to make it sound more professional and representative of your brand. And so there's those two facets of the business. And then for a nonprofit, they usually have a team where they're so focused on individual things that they don't have time to learn how to deal with a podcast and putting it all together. So that's where my team and I will come together and work with the organization to figure out, okay, what is your brand voice? What are your brand assets that we can use right now? Because that podcast, as I said before, is an extension of your existing brand. So from there, we got to start with strategy. Who is your audience? Who are you talking to on this podcast specifically? Because that might be slightly different from your overall audience, ideal client brand avatar. So we need to look at the back end of all of that stuff. And then we can create the things you were talking about, like the artwork, your intro, outro, picking music, because that really solidifies the feel and the brand and the messaging of what your podcast is going to sound like right from your theme song, pretty much. So there's so many pieces on there that you don't have to worry about, where we'll come in, we'll ask the questions and collaborate with you to figure out what works the best for your ideal listener, because each show is going to be unique. I equate a podcast to like going to the grocery store. You're going to go and buy yogurt. Well, how many shelves and tubs of yogurt are there? There's so many. You got the different flavors. You got sugar-free. You got dairy. You got non-dairy. It's the same with a podcast. You have so many podcasts out there, but how do you make it unique to you and your brand? So we got to figure that out and then make that happen.
Well, it sounds like you've got a number of perhaps tiers of service, or, like packages. You got your DIY. For someone like me, I don't need much guidance, but I might need a little bit of technical help or something like that.
Yep.
I would love to DIY it myself. Other people might definitely be more along the lines of, I'd like the medium, which I still want to do it myself, but I could use some help, maybe finding music and helping me out with the show flow or show flow outline, or even things like even someone to run past with a name. Like, hey, we were brainstorming. And do you do stuff like that? Because one of the things I do is go, hey, that's a great name. Then I hit Google and see if there's another podcast with that name or something similar. Most people don't do that.
By the way. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
That's one of the first steps I always tell people to do. I'm like, Google it first. Make sure it is not taken. Copyright, hello.
And by the way, just like spouses, all the best ones are taken. I'm just saying. Not that, but that's not strictly true. For instance, my podcast is called NONFICTION BRAND, and I did the Google search on that. I did the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office version of that. Europe and Canada, and I'm sure you've got copyright organizations that you can query their databases to see if anyone's got that name out there. But it's not impossible to create a compound name that can be uniquely yours. For example, organizedsound.ca. Organized sound, those are two words that don't go together, and yet when they do, it's kind of like peanut butter and chocolate. It makes sense, and it makes it unique. And again, your podcast name is Visible Voice.
The Podcaster's Guide to a Visible Voice, very long form, but visible voice is the key.
Yeah, and that's great, because again, hey, I'm sure you don't necessarily say 5 times during your podcast, welcome to a podcaster's guide to visible voice. You shorthand it. If you say anything, it's like, here on Visible Voice, we talk about things like the la 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 la. It's okay to shorthand stuff.
Yeah. But that's exactly it. When I was looking for the name, I was brainstorming, figuring out what I wanted, and I love alliteration, again, voice, audio. And so I went with visible voice. I'm like, that's it. That's the key. Those are my key words. And then you do the quick Google search, even something as simple as that. And I found there's already a podcast out there called Visible Voices, which was so similar. And then it's like, okay, who's my target audience? My ideal listener would be podcasters. Well, how about the Podcaster's Guide to a Visible Voice? It's unique. Nobody else had it. But then, like you said, I only need the shorthand. And even on the logo, like I highlight the fact that it is visible voice. And then the Podcaster's Guide's kind of like small, it's kind of there. But because the name Visible Voices existed, I had to tweak that.
It's kind of interesting because in marketing and advertising, everyone's familiar with the idea of a tagline, the tagline that goes with the logo or the name of the company or the brand. So, for Coca-Cola, it's had over since 1886 something like 225 different taglines. They're all associated with the brand name, but they are not the brand itself. However, the tagline helps differentiate or explain what's going on. So in your case, a podcaster's guide to, oh, I already know I'm in this audience. I'm a podcaster. I might want to check this out. So you're automatically differentiating yourself or creating a niche for yourself and your audience that says, we're going to be talking about stuff like this. Every episode, we might not be talking about microphones, but some we will. Other episodes, we might talk about a recent thing in the news about podcasting, like when Joe Rogan got $100 million US from Spotify. We might talk about that. Why? Because we're podcasters, So anyway, I see really a lot of value in what you're doing. And I want to spend next week's episode talking a lot about specifically how you help women navigate this wilderness, because I think it's probably a little bit distinctly different than a IT tech dad like me. I'm not afraid. This microphone I've had since I played these guitars in bands and stuff. So I'm not afraid of audio equipment and being a voiceover artist and stuff like that. Yeah, I've been around it for 30 years, all the way back to the days of tape where you cut it with a razor blade.
I still have my razor blade because prosperity.
Well, exactly. And you also know the pain of doing 54 takes and having to cut and splice in, which now, I mean, come on, I'm a Mac-based person, so GarageBand is my jam for even doing a podcast. But because I want to take it to an extra level of finish, there's some things that GarageBand doesn't do. So I open it up in a free audio editing system called Audacity, which I'm sure you're familiar with, to do 3 things. But those 3 things GarageBand doesn't do. And if you were a garden variety podcaster, you wouldn't know about it. The idea, Luffs wasn't that a lyric in 99 Luftballons or something? No, it has to do with loudness units and transforming or optimizing them, normalizing them for broadcast over the various podcast channels that serve it up and stuff like that. There's a lot of technical stuff that you can get into if you want to. But I'm here to tell you, and I'm sure Mary agrees with me, it's so much easier now than it's ever been in history to get your voice out over the airwaves, essentially, call it the digital airways.
Yep.
And if you're not doing it, you're leaving opportunity on the table.
Yeah, because before, I come from the radio background. And so if you wanted a radio show, like how many thousands of dollars did you have to pay for that syndicated show, for that airtime? Or, when I worked at radio, I created all the commercials. And so there was a sales guy, they'd sell it. So there would be a writer, the script. I get the script. I get to choose the voice, or the small business owner would come into the radio station. You got to book time for that. Like it's a big thing. And do you have time? You got to actually come to the radio station to get that recorded. And, that's where I actually got to hone my skills with voice coaching and working with other small business owners was at the radio station to make sure that they were relaxed behind the microphone and that, because it was a soundproof booth, it's a weird space. You're in a padded room essentially, and it's dark. And so people are not comfortable behind the mic. But nowadays, You can be in your own office, in your own space. You don't have to go anywhere. If you want to record an episode, you just plug your mic in, you hit record, and there you go. It is so much simpler, and you can get into the weeds of the LUFs and the normalizing and EQ and compression and all of that technical stuff, but you don't have to. But if you do want to elevate that aspect of the show, I mean, I'm here to help. That's what part of my business is as well.
Yeah, and I'm guessing a big part of your business is don't even worry about that. Start doing it, because you'll be glad you have no audience for the first 10 episodes, because you're still working out the bugs. You're getting comfortable with your system. You're getting comfortable with yourself. You're developing the skills you need to be an effective podcaster, not the least of which is actually listening and counting the number of times you say. If you want to be a great public speaker, do a podcast and edit it yourself, because you will hear every misspoken word, every time you're mumbling, bad diction, every every whatever. Like, okay, I got to be honest with you. My crap words that I have to cut out of every episode are, well, I'll always start out, well, that's an interesting comment. You can have a well here and there, but I like to say wells and nows and so's are like cilantro. A little bit of cilantro and some salsa is great, but a cilantro salsa? No, thank you. So podcasting, yeah, podcasting can work in your favor in a lot of different professional development ways, not the least of which is public speaking. So if you're looking to unlock some skills for your personal brand that are translatable into every meeting you're in, every presentation you give, every person you meet at a networking event, and, as a host, you're meeting people like I'm meeting Mary Chan right now. We've never talked. We've emailed, but already I've, over time, developed skills as a host that serve me well in real life, in real time, and I am so thrilled to talk to you about this because, again, an old white American guy can tell you how easy it is to podcast. It's an entirely different thing when someone who is on an island off the coast of British Columbia, and it's not an insignificant island, by the way. I've been to Victoria.
Big island.
What a gorgeous city, but it's not exactly kissing cousins to Manhattan or New York or Chicago or LA or even Toronto, Montreal, Quebec City, or any other meaningful place in Canada. And that doesn't stop you, though. You're talking to a guy in Wisconsin, USA, via a podcast because you're out there sharing your voice, your experience, and your expertise via a podcast.
Yeah. There are no borders on a podcast. I love to meet people globally, and you just get to create this community and to use your voice and to practice your voice, because there's no better way to get your message across. Whatever that message is, people really gravitate more towards your natural voice than anything else that you do. It's not the social media videos, it's not the blog posts or newsletters that you are going to create, but it is the use of your voice, because you can write something the same way multiple times, but you'll never get that emotion across until you speak it. And so when you get to practice on a podcast and meet people saying, you might have the same message each and every time, but you can say it different way each and every time, and you get to practice new ways whenever you have an episode recorded.
Amen, sister. And obviously we go to the same church, the Church of Podcasting, and we both really promote it wherever we can to people. And next week we're going to go in deeper specifically on talking about how you help females, how you help women do this, because it can be a little bit daunting for everybody, but especially if you aren't comfortable in front of a mic, if you aren't comfortable with technology, if you aren't comfortable with what your message is, or what we like to say in marketing, your message platform is, or even have you done the work on your personal brand to know what you should be talking about. All these things require a lot of help if you can't do it yourself, or you don't, if that's not your jam. Well, Mary's going to be talking about that next week. But before we leave this episode this week, I do want listeners to have the opportunity to connect with you, Mary. Is there any way? Well, first of all, I think you've got an offer for people listening to the podcast. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we're talking a lot right now about branding and figuring out who your ideal listener is. And if you don't really know who that is, or you're thinking about starting a podcast, but is it the same as my, say, client avatar and who I sell to? Well, let's get that going with an ideal listener worksheet. So that way you can really hone in who are you going to be talking to on your podcast? Who is it that will be your ideal listener to really figure out your audience, because everything that you do will be based on that one person. Your artwork, your music, how you speak, the format of your show, the length of your show, what's going to go into the show will be all because of your ideal listener.
Okay, right now, if you're watching the live stream, you can see on screen that it says Get Mary's 5 Keys worksheet at organizedsound.ca/5keys. Definitely check that out and get that, but I'm guessing there's a different URL associated with your ideal listener worksheet.
Yeah, that's the same, organizedsound.ca/ideal listener. The 5 keys will be great for next week when we talk about getting behind the mic and finding your voice and working with women.
All right, so I'm going to repeat that one more time for listeners. If you want to get Mary's ideal listener worksheet, it's not that hard. All you have to do is go to let me say that again. All you have to do is go to organizedsound.ca/ideal listener, all one word, lowercase.
Yeah, got it.
And you'll be able to download that. So definitely do that and check that out. And if you are interested in finding out whether maybe your podcast idea should take off, I see that you've also got a complimentary 30-minute strategy session available at organizedsound.ca. So if you want to check that out, take her up on that 30-minute strategy, because having the right strategy will save you hours, if not days, if not months of pain. So please go to organizedsound.ca/ well, it's the homepage right there. Complimentary 30-minute strategy session. Click that Let's Chat button and get chatting.
Let's
with
chat. That's right.
The lovely and talented Mary Chan. Once again, I want to thank you for being on the Nonfiction Brand podcast. I would love for listeners. Can you do me a solid, listeners? Can you please subscribe, refer, and review this podcast? Because guess what? Those star reviews that you do, that really helps other people find it. And also, if you're interested, listeners, you can get worksheets from me as well. Go to nonfictionbrand.com/gift to download 3 personal branding technique questions, worksheets, whatever. You don't even have to sign up for my email list, which I never send anything to, but please avail yourself of those, because those can get you started on your nonfiction brand personal branding building journey. So definitely check that out. And once again, I want to say a big thanks to Mary Chan for being on the Nonfiction Brand podcast. I am, of course, your host, DP Knudten, but she is
Mary Chan.
And we'll be talking at you again next week. Bye-bye. Pause. Kick it over to the live stream audience. Hey, guys, we're going into week 2. Yeah, same day, different weeks. Yeah, I'm telling you, it's quantum shifting going on. But that's what happens when you've got a podcast. And I do this because I want to talk to someone deeply for an hour and then divide it into 2 30-minute-ish podcasts. So that's what I'm doing right now. And we're going to go right back into this with me talking with my guest, Mary Chan. All right, so let's just be honest here. Anyone watching the live stream can tell that I am a 6'3+ white male American, and consequently my point of view is colored by those attributes. However, based on my experience, and again, not all women, not all men, But some people have trouble with even wrapping their brains around the idea of, I have to juggle technology. I have to juggle scheduling of guests. How do I even identify guests? What is this podcast hosting thing I hear so much about? Is a podcast host a person or a website? How do I get, if I do it, how do I get on Apple Podcasts? Because I would like to be right next to, NPR or CBC podcasts. How do I get on Apple Podcasts? I don't know where to start. Help me, please. There are a lot of questions, and people like me, again, 6'3" white Americans, are like, I'll figure this out myself, and I'll figure it out with a chainsaw in my hand. Other people might go, you know what? I prefer to have someone guide me, to help me, to at least stop me from stepping on the landmines that could cost time, money, aggravation, and emotional trauma. You have pointed out via your website that you are, well, let me read it. Shall I?
Okay.
My goal is to empower women and women-led organizations to make an impact with their vision, message, and stories through the power of their natural voice by podcasting. The world needs diverse voices, and I'm so glad you are a part of this audio adventure. 1, good on you for niching down. You eliminated an entire gender or sex of the human race, but that actually serves you well, because I'm guessing the people you can best serve are a little bit more like you, or that you are certainly understanding where they're coming from. Why did you overtly decide that women were the people that you were going to focus on in terms of getting them into the podcasting world?
Yeah, it starts back with my radio background. So when I worked in radio, producing commercials, and the small business owners would come in. Now, this doesn't happen all the time, but there were a couple clients that really stuck out. It's the women who were just really unsure behind the mic. Sometimes they'd walk into the studio and they're like, all right, why am I here? And I'm like, nobody told you why you're here. Okay, here's your script. Let's go through it. And they're like, oh, I'm here to read a commercial. Okay. And they start tightening up their voice and they don't know how to speak anymore because they're so nervous and they just kind of ramble on the script. And so it was my job to really calm them down, try and get them to relax so that they can still be themselves, and have them speak to me because I was their listener and it was somebody that they could relate to. And I found working with more women just really, really fed my soul, because there were a couple instances, and again, only a very few times this happened, but there would be some men, small business owners, who would come in and they're like, yeah, I got this. I'm going to read the script. Okay, here we go. And they start screaming into the microphone and they're reading their script and they're like, all right, that's a take. And I'm like, no, actually, let's try that again. But I don't know if it was because I'm a woman, I am Chinese, I am what? I don't know. But they did not take my direction very well. They wanted it their way, and they didn't wanna listen to me. And so those 2 moments really stuck out to me when I started my podcast production company. So I was downsized from the radio career in 2018, and when I realized I wanted to stay working in the audio industry, what could I do? Podcasting seemed like a natural fit since I listened to so many podcasts. And when I decided to go down this rabbit hole and realize this was actually a need, people needed my help producing a podcast, well, I got to figure out, like, who do I want to work with? And thinking back to my time in radio, that kind of solidified it. I just really wanted to support the people who were uncomfortable behind the microphone, and that they wanted to create a really great sounding product to represent who they are, truly who they are. Because again, like I said, when sometimes people get behind the mic, they get all squidgy almost. And they're like, oh, what is this thing in front of me? And so I want to help them empower themselves to be able to speak confidently behind the microphone. And yeah, I put on my website, it's for women, but really, it's anyone who wants to be comfortable behind the microphone and would like to learn more about empowering their own voice.
You know, you did what a lot of people don't do, and even some brands don't do, and that is identify the perfect or the avatar audience member that you want to talk to, or the client that you definitely want to bring in, the ones that you can best serve based on who you are, what you do, and how you do it, based on your experience. And you happily said, you know what? I don't need Mr. One Take caffeinated guy who belittles me and makes me feel like garbage. I don't need some other person who may have a similar demeanor or a type A personality. I need people who will come to me with open hands, open arms, open hearts, open minds, so that I can help them my way, which may not be the way other people need. Because here's the thing, when you're a personal brand and a small business, you tend to want to serve everybody all the time, everything, because you need money coming in. That's a mistake, because you're lavishing your attention, your time, your bandwidth, and your blood, sweat, and tears sometimes on people who don't want that level of attention or don't deserve it. And you're denying it perhaps on the best people that would fit exactly who you are and what you want to do. So everything I heard you say, none of it had to do with, well, I identified the sector that has the most money,
Yeah.
Disposable income.
Yeah.
You didn't do any of that financial garbage, which, it's not garbage. Let's face it, a business model should have a direct line of sight to an actual paying customer. But that wasn't your primary goal. It was to serve people that you could best serve based on who you are, what you do, and how you do it.
I mean, honestly, I just want to have fun. Like, radio was fun. Podcasting should be fun. So why am I going to start a business to work for myself and not have any fun with some people that might not jive with who I am? So, I mean, obviously, starting out a business for the first time, it was like, "Okay, I'll take whoever wants to pay me money." Yeah. But very quickly, I realized it was, "Oh my gosh, this is almost like traumatizing. I'm living my past from my radio days of these bad clients. I don't want these bad clients again." And that's when I was like, "Nope, I gotta switch. I have to go with my gut, and I have to go with my intuition on this because I wanna have fun." That was kind of the main goal.
Yeah, well, and I'm sure by aligning yourself with the right people, you can serve them better, which turns them into an unpaid sales force for you via personal recommendations and referrals and e-invitations that I want to email introduce you. You guys, I think,
Yeah.
would hit it off great. How many of those referrals have you gotten?
Yeah, and I think that's the beautiful part of where I am in my business now. It's like I don't have to go out and, quote unquote, sell, sell, sell anymore because people realize who I am. They've heard me speak multiple times. I have my own podcast. It's kind of like they do their Google search on me and they're stalking me, and I don't have to do anything. It's already all there, and they know who I am based on, again, my voice. They know who I am. When they get on that discovery call, they're like, "Oh, it's you. Yeah, you sound just like who you are on your podcast." I'm like, "Yeah, exactly, because that is who I am. And I want to work with you if you want to work with me and you like how I sound."
Yeah, that is so key right there. When someone says, you sound exactly like you do on your podcast, when they meet you in person or over the phone or over Zoom, you've got a personal brand that's working because one of the things that I write about in my book, Nonfiction Brand, is a podcaster that I follow, Scott Galloway, who is a professor of marketing at NYU's Stern School of Business. He's also on the Pivot podcast with Kara Swisher of the New York Times, and he's also got his Prof G podcast. He's an acquired taste for some people. For me, love him, have followed him for probably 7 years, and he once said on one of the Pivot podcasts that when he meets people in person for the first time, if they come up with a question and kind of an earnest look on their face, they've seen him speak. When they kind of wave at him and go, Prof T, whatever, they've seen his videos. But when they come up and act like you're their friend, they've listened to his podcast. Mm-hmm. Because without getting ooey gooey gross, you are literally inside someone's head with your voice for the however many times they listen to you. If you've got a fan who's listened to every podcast you've ever done, in my case, this will probably be in the 190 episodes, somewhere in there when this finally comes out. That's 190 dates I've had with someone that I've never met. And it's amazing the intimacy and what you alluded to it last week, the authenticity that you've been able to demonstrate with your voice. And again, one of the things I love about Mary Chan is the name of her flippin' podcast, The Podcaster's Guide to, or you tell me what the name is. I'm going to butcher it.
You had it right. The Podcaster's Guide to a Visible Voice.
To a visible voice. So much of what I do with the Nonfiction Brand podcast is encourage people to own the only thing that is truly theirs, that is 100% theirs and 100% unique, and that is their voice, their experience, their expertise. And their voice is the way you share those things. You have to own your voice. And now you're telling me that you can make that voice visible via a podcast? I think that's a really interesting coinage of an idea and a name that really pays off, because I truly believe in the idea that a podcast is your voice made visible. And not only in the form of a podcast that you hear, but guess what? Every recording you do can be transcribed and turned into HTML text that you put on your website that is then immediately crawlable by Google and other search engines, which can instantly help you with your SEO. You are demonstrating your expertise in areas. Guess what? The web crawlers figure that out, and you rank better because you're constantly talking about similar subjects and stuff like that. I mean, the voice amplification possibilities of having a podcast are obvious to me, to you, but maybe not to all of your clients, especially those who have never even considered getting in front of a mic a possibility for them because they're a little shy or a little bit timid or a little bit stingy, if you will, with their voice. You know what I'm talking about? I think you do.
Yep. I've had people who come to me and they're like, I like the idea of starting a podcast, but is it really right for me? Should everyone have one? And okay, honestly, not everyone should have a podcast. You know, there are some situations where that might not be your best medium. However, for most people, podcasting is such a great way to connect with people, other people on a human, emotional level. And so I, go into what is one thing that you can talk about all the time, constantly, that you'll never get bored of. That kind of right there is your podcast. If you can figure out what that is, then you should be having too much trouble with everything else, because like on your show, wow, 30 minutes every week with someone for over 190, you said, like that's a lot of stuff to talk about. And you don't get tired of it. Clearly, you are very passionate about the subject of branding, personal branding. And
absolutely.
So, yeah.
Well,
and was that one of the things that you decided when you launched your podcast? What was the one thing that you could not stop talking about, right?
Well, yeah, because I'll be honest, the whole nonfiction brand idea came about because, as you can see, you look at my face, I've got this nice salt and pepper beard that is a whole lot more salt than pepper. And consequently, later on in my career, when downturns happen, or in my case, agencies merge, and all of a sudden they're trying to reconcile who stays in and who gets out, you reach the age that I call your X years. You're excellent, you're an expert, you're experienced, you're expensive and therefore expendable. And thankfully, I've so far avoided the last X, which is ex-spouse. I've been married 25 years, and she evidently hasn't wised up yet. So knock on wood. I hope she doesn't.
There's always a yet, right?
Well, well, put it this way. The fact that I'm aware of yet, that's still in my head. I think we're going to be okay because you never take the person you love for granted. Anyway, I don't want to go down that path. This is not a marriage therapy podcast, although it should be sometimes. But the whole point is, when you reach your X years like me, you've probably spent your entire career working more or less anonymously. Now, the people who work directly with you know who you are, what you do and how you do it, what you're good at, why they should deal with you, what value you bring. But the greater world, and by greater, I mean people in your industry who have never heard of you and should know your name because you're really good at what you do, but you haven't bothered to share your voice and your experience through something like a podcast. This is why I get so passionate about this. If you are not building your personal brand right now, you are a commodity. And what are commodities bought for? The lowest possible price. And what do brands command? A premium price, because people understand their value. And let me tell you, listeners to this podcast have heard these stories ad nauseum. I don't want to talk about me. I want to talk about you. Let me ask you this question, because I've always been curious. I see not all, and again, not all women, but there are many podcasts featuring women that have a duo. My Favorite Murder, two duos, two women talking about their favorite murders, and cooking shows. It's a duo, sometimes a trio. Meanwhile, on the other side of the fence, there are a lot of men who are like, "No, I'll have a solo show, and I'll have people on, and I'll talk to them, and all that stuff." Is there a recommendation or a reason that you see that so many people feel more comfortable having a co-host? I mean, what's your thinking about co-hosts?
I like them as long as there is energy and they gel well together. Again, I got to go back to my radio days. Sometimes there'd be morning shows where they were put together, forced together because of, management or whatnot. And they didn't always work out, and you could hear it. And so I would apply that same thing on your podcast. If you guys are friends already, that's great. But sometimes, do you have that chemistry on the air when you are behind the microphone? And I find a lot of women like the co-host because they don't like to go things alone. They like to be in community with other people. They like to share their thoughts with their friends. You can even take this way back into the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages. Women were never allowed to speak. We were not allowed to talk. The men were in power, and so they did all the talking. All the women were allowed to do were to talk with each other. And so over the generations, I feel like that still is kind of true. And that's where we get into the women gab fest and those types of stereotypes, because women are so in tuned and gravitate towards other women to share in that voice. And so I don't think co-hosts or, three hosts is a good or bad thing. Again, I'm going to go back to who is your ideal listener and what is the benefit that the listener gets out of when they listen to the both of them as the co-host versus one.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's some really good promotional reasons to have more people involved, because my network plus your network is, when it comes to booking guests, we have more possibilities. When it comes to getting the word out, we have more possibilities. When it comes to sharing workload, like you do the show notes and I'll make sure the audio is cut. All of a sudden, that takes it spreads the weight. So there's a lot of value there. And I think that's a really good thing for people to think about, not just women, but all people. Is there a benefit in having a co-host, or are you like me? I don't feel I can count on someone to do the job the way it needs to be done as much as I can, as I want. It's the bar that I set. And consequently, and this is based on a lot of past experience, and I just want you to know this, that I've come to depend on myself because, okay, remember back in high school when someone said, hey, let's have a band? I'd be the one who goes out and buy the equipment and be there for every rehearsal, and even the ones where no one else shows up, because it's like, but we said we were going to have a band, and then we never do. So this, again, is not a therapy session.
Scorn, so scorned.
But it does come back to understanding who you are as a person. Do you feel you could have an hour-long conversation with someone, or whatever the time period you choose to do is? Do you feel like you've got the confidence in front of the mic, and not only there, but in email conversations with potential guests? And do you have the gumption and wherewithal to do all the stuff that's necessary? Because, I'm sure you've mentioned the fact that you have a team. I don't. I'm a one-man show. I wonder why that is. I think I explained that just 5 minutes ago. Oh, yeah. Anyway, but I am a one-man show, so I know every position in the car or on the bus, and that's great because I can do them all. But other people aren't going to want to do them all. So you really have to understand who you are, what your level of commitment is, and what your level of passion is. Again, I'm a performer. I love being on a mic. I love being on camera, and I love talking to people who have interesting things to say and learning from them. So what are your thoughts when it comes to that, when it comes to defining whether you should be a solo host with guests or a duo or some variation thereof?
Yeah. It comes back down to, what is the purpose of the podcast? Why do you want to create a podcast in the first place? And then again, I'm going to be the broken record. Who's your ideal listener? So who are you talking to? Because, for example, I have a client who, she created her first season with a co-host, but then the co-host didn't have time anymore and she wanted to leave. And so she was stuck with doing it by herself. But the idea of doing it by herself just really overwhelmed her because she didn't feel comfortable and confident behind the mic to drive the interviews by herself. And it was an interview style show. And so she looked for a friend to be that co-host because she needed that confidence piece with someone by her side. And so her passion really is to bring these stories alive, but she didn't necessarily need to do it with herself and her own voice. She wanted a companion. And then also I have another client who really wanted to go the co-host route because she wanted it more to drive conversation about women empowerment and not to be that extension of her business brand. So what I mean by that is that the podcast is not about her business and what she does directly. It's more of an indirect route. And so what she wanted to do was just to be the sidekick. So like on TV and radio, you usually have the main host and then you got the sidekick. She just wanted to be a sidekick and to have a podcast, but she wasn't sure about doing all the work. And so she got her friend who ended up being the main host and did all the technical stuff. And then she did what she thought would be like the fun stuff, which is the email and the marketing and that sort of thing. So it really depends on what you were saying too about that passion. What is your passion that maybe you can talk about forever, but that you want to do as well?
Well, and it all comes back to having a truly strategic view of who you are, what you want your podcast to actually do, and who that listener is. So that's where I get to plug you a little bit and say, go to organizedsound.ca. Let me say that again, organizedsound.ca. And on that homepage, you'll not only see Mary's face, but you'll also see a big purple box that says complimentary 30-minute strategy session. It's time to take your time back, or let's say it's time to get your time back. So let's schedule a complimentary 30-minute Oh, I can't say strategy today. Schedule a complimentary 30-minute strategy session. Strategy session. How about that? Experience what others are saying by contacting me today, etc. Anyway, check it out. I think it's probably well worth that 30-minute conversation because you will meet the lovely and talented Mary Chan just like I have right now. You mentioned last week that you had an ideal listener worksheet. And again, that was available at organizedsound.ca/ideal listener. All one word, lowercase. So check that out. But there's also another one that you, I think, want to invite people to download. Can you tell us about your 5-key, what is it called? The 5 Keys worksheet.
The 5 Keys worksheet is something that I send when people are a little bit uncomfortable behind the mic. So I do voice coaching as well for podcasters. So that's getting them to realize and have that awareness of what their voice can do, whether that is speaking a little faster, slower, higher pitch, lower pitch, having melody in your voice is how you can really connect with your listeners and that emotional connection that I keep talking about. So if you go to get my 5 Keys worksheet, that'll give you some quick pointers on how to really amplify your voice and thus making your voice more visible.
And the Visible Voice podcast is what she's all about. And again, the full official title of Mary Chan's podcast is
The Podcaster's Guide to a Visible Voice.
Check that out wherever you find podcasts for free, just like where you get the Nonfiction Brand podcast. Speaking of the Nonfiction Brand podcast, listeners, can you do me a real solid? I would love for you to like, subscribe, refer, and review this podcast wherever you find podcasts for free, because that really does help other people find it. And I really would appreciate it if you did that. Also, if you would like to download some free worksheets from me to you for absolute free, go to nonfictionbrand.com/gift. You'll be able to download 3 downloadable PDFs that will get you started on your personal nonfiction brand journey. So, I want to thank you again, Mary, for being on the Nonfiction Brand podcast. What a treat. It's great to talk to one of our neighbors from the north. In this case, Mary's from Victoria, British Columbia. I've had the opportunity to sit on the harbor, and enjoy the float planes come flying in. So that, if you want a tip, a pro tip to anyone who likes the Pacific Northwest, go to Port Angeles, Washington, and take the ferry across to Victoria. Yes, you will not be disappointed.
Yeah.
And by the way, if you want to tell the Victoria Vacation Board or Bureau that I'm hyping them up, just let them know, because I do take on
Send some
sponsors.
Credits your way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. And I would love some swag, some maple syrup maybe.
Okay.
All right.
Of course.
Anyway, I want to thank you again, Mary, for being on the Nonfiction Brand podcast. I am, of course, your host, DP Knudten, and she is
Mary Chan.
And I'll be talking at you again next week. Bye-bye. Pause as I turn to the live stream audience. I'm done for today, and so is Mary. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you'll check back the next time you see that I'm going live, because otherwise no one's watching, and that's okay too, but I do appreciate your kind attention. So I'll be talking at you guys next time. See ya. Bye-bye.